Marijuana's bad.
Hi guys, I'm AK, and today I'd like to share with you 10 more, less obvious tips and tricks for making your arrangements sound super sweet in Ableton Live's arrangement mode. If you've seen some of my other videos, you know that I don't really spend a lot of time on prerequisite knowledge. These videos are pitched at intermediate and advanced live users. But if you have any questions about any of the things that you see in any of these videos, please connect with me on the social webs and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Anyway, let's get going. Tip 11. Have you ever been trying to freeze and flatten a track and then gotten this message and been like, ugh? And you're like, but I spent an hour on that compressor settings and also trying all these weird sidechain routings. Have no fear. Create a new track, move the offending sidechaining input effect onto a new track, then freeze the original track, flatten it, and move the effect back to where it was and delete the blank track. Ta-da! Crisis averted. Tip 12. Did you know that grooves in your groove pool are actually MIDI clips? So you can drag any groove onto a MIDI track and easily make a quick swung percussion clip. Or you can extract the groove from an existing song and grab the hits and transients from someone else's breakdown, and then bring that in as a MIDI clip. Mr. Bill does some super cool shit where he chops up audio with an auto panner. And then renders it. And then extracts the groove from these little slices and then uses that groove to make weird stutter-like fills in his songs. He calls this technique exponential rhythms, and he's probably the most badass producer I've ever heard. Just saying. Tip 13. Let's say you have some crazy instrument rack with a ton of synths stacked together, and maybe you're morphing between them using the chain selector. One of the limitations of the chain selector is that you can't sort of morph on a single note because the chain requires new MIDI data to trigger the next sound that you've selected on your chain. I want to explore a clever setup which lets you work around this limitation. Let me explain what's going on here. We're using the sidechain input of a gate plugin, which is listening to each synth on our rack. Then in this group, we tell the chain selector to tell live which gated signal to run through when there's audio coming through. Because of this, we can play one single note and morph between the patches with one knob, but we don't have to send a note off message to trigger the next synth. This is significant because we can draw curves into this chain selector to interpolate the morph functions just a little bit more. So basically, this is just a logical extension of using the sidechain's listen functionality as an external input from my 20 Ableton tips video. My intuition tells me that there's a lot more you can do with this, so maybe I'll do a whole video on sidechain input. Tip 14. Do you use the metronome when you're writing? You should. One thing I like to do when I'm writing fills, or when I want to think about the beats differently, is to double the denominator on the metronome, which will give you sort of a double time feel. So in this case, I'll make the metronome 4/8, and you can hear how hits on the metronome are added more frequently. This does not change the timing in any significant way, but I think it just helps your brain hear different divisions in the piece you're writing. Tip 15. Every single one of my projects has an empty MIDI channel across the top, which I can use to color and title the various sections and parts of my track. This is also useful for grabbing a section you want to work on and quickly looping it, or even moving stuff around using cut and paste time. Also, if you're collaborating with someone else, you can right-click on these clips, hit Edit Info Text, and then the little info view in the bottom left becomes a notepad for you to type notes about the section, either to yourself, if you're crazy, or so that some other producer you're working with can make sense out of the mess that you've made. It's also really nice to give yourself a section for track development at the beginning of your project, so you can have a place to sort of write music without anything else going on. And it's also not confusing when you're using this method of labeling things as a MIDI track. Tip 16. Let's say you're compressing your drums and you spend time meticulously programming Live's compressor. Then your conscious mind starts whining to itself, but I have this super expensive, super tight plugin that would let me shape this just a little bit better. So you drop in your new device, turn off the first one, and spend probably way too long programming that compressor. Now you think you're done, but you have to A/B stuff to be sure. Here's a quick way to A/B without having to click the mouse 4 times. Turn one device off, turn one device on. Type Command K or press the key selector in the top right-hand corner to enter key mapping mode. Click one of the devices and hit a key, and then click the other device and hit that same key. We can see the routing that we've configured here, and then we can exit key mapping. Hooray! Now with one key, you can turn off one effect and the other on simultaneously. To me, this makes it much easier to actually listen and spend less time clicking around like a fool. Tip 17. Every single DAW I've ever used has had this problem where if a pitch bend MIDI CC message gets triggered and you stop playback before the pitch bend reaches 0, the pitch CC number stays where it is until it's re-triggered by a clip with a pitch envelope. This can make your clips sound out of tune and you just can't figure out why. So, by default, every time I'm writing something in MIDI, the first thing I do after I make my MIDI clip is insert anchored pitch points at 0. So if I end up bending pitch later on in a musical phrase, it isn't totally borked when I stop the clip and play it back at the beginning. If this isn't your style, consider using this Max for Live device that will help you deal with pitch bend as a knob in line on your device chain, rather than needing to look at the pitch envelope. Tip 18. MIDI is amazing, and it contains tons of parameters that you probably weren't aware of. So create an empty MIDI channel, create a clip, and then go to our envelope selector and just look at what's here. Some synths will actually let you map parameters directly to these functions, particularly with breath or modulation, which is the mod wheel. And some presets within synths will already have some complex assignments already mapped to a few of these functions. Here's a nifty Max for Live device which exposes all of these parameters as knobs rather than as envelopes, so you can hear what they do just by moving them and not having to dig through the envelope menu. Then you can write MIDI modulation onto the knob itself or onto the clip, whichever your preference.
Tip 19. So I like to do sound design with audio effects. And one way to make this process faster, I found, is to create a rack, and here I have a rack that contains all of the native effects in Ableton that I frequently use. And they're all turned off. And I like doing this because then it makes it easy right on the rack to just go to an effect, bring it in, automate some of the values, maybe the dry wet on this chorus, and then turn the effect off and automate it turning on. And it's easy to do this for a number of effects in serial. So here I'll try it with the phaser, same sort of thing. Maybe automate the frequency down, and then turn it off, and then bring it back in just for that little part. And you can continue this process by just bringing in effects and writing little automation sequences. The nice thing is it doesn't take up that much CPU, because when the effects are off, they're not using your resources. And the order of these effects is pretty intentional. I try to put modulation stuff first, distortion in the middle, and delays at the end. But here I'll just do the same thing with frequency shifting. I tend to get mixed results with this one, but it's a cool way to work on your automation and not spend time searching through the browser to find an effect you're looking for. I recommend starting out with a rack of a bunch of native Ableton devices that you use frequently and know very well.
Tip 20. So you've made it to the end of my video. You must think I have something valuable to say. I'm humbled and flattered. No, seriously, I am. So this last tip is more philosophical than practical. Let's say you have an arrangement you've worked really hard on, and you just can't bear to compose anymore. My advice, before you mix, listen back and close your eyes, or at least get your eyes away from the computer. There's an interesting psychological phenomenon called the McGurk effect. Yeah, I don't think it was discovered by this guy. But anyway, it basically explains how we unconsciously process visual information, which affects how we hear something based on what we're seeing while we hear it. The McGurk effect is generally used to describe how we understand speech based on whether or not we can see the person talking. But I'd like to apply it in this case to music production. When you see all the components to your song in all their colorful, blocky goodness, your brain is breaking down the components in a similar fashion. This is good to some extent, and that's why we love making music with Ableton. However, this is bad when you realize that no one is going to watch your song advance as blocks but you. When you're mixing and putting the finishing touches on your track, you don't want to see your song, you just want to hear it. So simply put, before you mix, close your eyes, hit the spacebar, and just listen. Take notes if you have to, but avoid looking at the display if you can. It's impossible to be objective about your own tracks, but hopefully a little bit of targeted sensory deprivation can help your ears hear beyond what your eyes see. Remember not to spend too much time in a dark room, lest you become completely out of touch with the real world. So these are my tips for arrangement mode. I hope you've learned something. Now, go make music. Oh yeah, and listen to my music too.